Okay, tonight's going to be just a little bit of a review because I got a number of questions asked, and so we want to reconnect to where we ended up last week. And then I'll try to, I don't know if there were so much questions as they were anxieties of saying difficult of making sure we make good decisions, and mostly in the health care of our loved ones, but also in the way we view life. All right, so we'll just kind of ease through the first few just to remind us of what we're talking about and dealing with ethical standards and morality. Real easy to say, and you hear people talk about it all the time, and people talk about things being immoral without sometimes even know what morality is. And sometimes people talk about things being unethical, and they really don't have any ethical standards in their life. So it's important for particularly us as Christians to understand the ultimate standard of morality and ethics. And if you don't know who God is, and you don't know the goodness of God, and you don't know the design of God, and you are not in conformity with the will of God, then there's really no ultimate standard. Because then it just kind of boils down to what you might want or what I might want, and that's never going to be in total agreement. And so we have to view life the way God viewed life, and we were talking last week about, specifically about in our society, attitudes about life with abortion and euthanasia and those kind of things. And so you have to go back again and connect to God. And we have to view human life, or should view human life, the way God does. And God views it as us being the creatures that He's created in His image after His likeness. You suppose, that being the case, that He would value our lives. That He would think it's significant that we represent Him as His creation. And so it's important then that we understand that, and that's why He re-emphasized after the flood that particular truth. That whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And He re-emphasized the reason is that we are created in God's likeness. So we don't take that lightly, and we don't take life, innocent life. And He described it in His law as, in a protective way, thou shalt not kill. And again, most of the commandments we've grown up with, the way they've been depicted to us oftentimes is we view them as being chiseled on these granite stones, and they're all these thou shalt not. But we don't always absorb why He said thou shalt not. Thou shalt not kill. If we view our relationship with Him, that we're created in His image, and that He is the one who breathes into us the breath of life. It is He who places souls within us, that He wants us to see life the same way and see each other the same way, and He wants to protect that life. So it's of a great value to God, and we've looked at that last week in contrast to Him, the Son of God, talking about the fowl of the air, and that if God cares for them, certainly He cares for you. He cares for us. And this is just a review. So man should view it that way. We should choose life. In Deuteronomy 30, Moses placed before the children of Israel God's charge. He said, I'll place before thee life and death, and good and evil. Choose life and live. So life ought to be a choice in the sense that we recognize who we are, and we recognize why we're here, to glorify Him, and we ought to choose life. In that particular context, He also illustrated that if we weren't obedient to His will, then that's death. That separates us from Him, that separates us from His blessings, and so we get a choice. If we're doing what He tells us to do, we get to choose life. And that brings us back to our standard of morals and ethics, and that is the goodness of God and His care for us, and that therefore we ought to care for each other. We ought to make sure that we dedicate ourselves, our lives, to the Lord. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, Paul said, I beseech you, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And we use in our very first discussion, verse 2 of that context, of that standard of morality and ethics. Being not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you might prove what is that good, acceptable, and here it is, perfect will of God. There it is. That's what we're here for, and that's what causes us to be able to navigate in life in a way that God's pleasing with it. We offer our life as living sacrifices. There are probably occasions in our existence where it would be easier to die for the Lord than it would to live for the Lord. Because we know as Christians, death is not the end. Death is that triumphant delivery. And Paul had said he was caught in the strait between the two, having desire to go and be with the Lord. But to stay here is more needful. So indicating that if we offer our bodies as living sacrifices, sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes that's painful. But we need to choose life so that we can demonstrate that for the Lord and offer that to the Lord. Paul offered his life, as he said in Galatians 2 and verse 20, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. That Christ liveth in me. The life, there he is, the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So we're to reverence it as it was stated in the law, thou shalt not kill. And that's part of every time the Lord was asked, what's the first and great commandment? He always answered, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, with all thy strength. Though he wasn't asked what the second commandment was, he generally gave the second commandment, didn't he? And the second is likened unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There's that respect for God, the giver of life, and the respect for the life that God has given. And that's kind of where we ought to be. And the biblical view then of death it's the price of sin, according to Romans chapter 6 and verse 23. The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. So sin is that which causes death. It is the enemy. Death is the enemy that Satan has plagued upon man when he caused man to sin and therefore be separated from the tree of life. And that's interesting, isn't it? We even refer back to that time when God made the first couple and he placed them in the garden and he described that they could eat of all the trees of the garden, and he placed the tree of life there. They could eat of that tree. And the one tree that they were forbidden to eat of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he said, for the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. You see, that sin is that spiritual death that we're talking about. And so we need to see that contrast. I did correct that, Brother Paul, if you notice that Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, I had 2, I think, last week. It's appointed a man once to die, and after that, the judgment. So death is part of our knowledge, part of what we know is going to happen. Christ delivers us from the fear of death. And we won't go back over all those verses, but just to emphasize that to you. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is that triumphant chapter about the resurrection and power over death. The last enemy to be conquered is death. And we're reviewing those because when you get into the things in our society that society has conflicts over, and their description of what is ethical or moral or accepted or rejected, there's this conflicting set of standards. And abortion is one of those things. And we talked about that a little bit last week, a termination of human pregnancy. And this is intentional termination. We know that women sometimes have miscarriages and sometimes there are accidents, and we mentioned some verses about that last week. But this is an intentional termination of life, and that's something we have to be conscious of. And I mentioned to you last week, and I want to mention again, that when we talk about these things, there's always a possibility, maybe even a probability, in an assembly like this, that there'd be one or more of us who are guilty of some of the things that we described, have been in our past. And it's not the intention in this class to make people have to relive that or feel like they're still guilty of that. If they repented of that and God's forgiven them of that, then that's not something they need to worry about. But it doesn't change the moral standard. It doesn't change the ethical dilemma that we need to talk about it. And so I hope we take it in that spirit, that every sin that I've committed, I am fully conscious of its consequences. I know what it's done to me. I know what it's done to other people. And it's ugly to me. I don't want to be guilty of those things again. But I don't go around under the burden of guilt of that. God's faithful. And I've confessed those sins and He's forgiven me of those sins. But it behooves me to warn people about sin. To share with people the ugliness of sin so that they can avoid it and they not be guilty of it. And so that's where we need to be in these discussions. And I thought the definition, I mentioned this to you last week, and then we'll move on because I want to get to some of the questions that I was asked. But Webster defines the termination of human pregnancy after, accompanied by, resulting in, or closely followed by the death of the embryo and fetus. We don't like to talk about that part of it. We talk about abortion as if it's just some kind of vague, vaporous happening that we can choose to do or not do. When you really look at what it is an ending of life. And that puts us back in that dilemma of, can we look at it through God's eyes, from God's perspective, from God's goodness, and say that's something we have the right to do in a moral, ethical society. We won't go through all these definitions again. I'll just put them up there just so you can be reminded, because this is what provoked most of the discussion, is in looking at euthanasia. There are some states who have legalized physician-assisted suicide. They have legalized the right to die, and those things have been challenged in Supreme Court. Interestingly, the Supreme Court's come down on the side of saying, constitutionally, we don't have a right to die. We have a right to live. The Constitution grants us life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And all the things that are constructed there are for our life and protection, for the freedom to have life and protection, but really doesn't address that we have a right to die. So constitutionally, they've had some challenges in those areas, but just to know that people are wanting to legalize either taking your own life or having someone assist you in ending life is a disturbing thought. And that's what provoked, we talked about voluntary and involuntary experiences where people ask for assistance and they're given it. Those who other people make decisions for them, they become incompetent when somebody decides. And that's where the discussion took place, and I was asked if we could look at that in a little more detail. Yes, sir.
One of the questions, the petition I had, it really resulted from the previous slide.
Okay.
It's where you've got there active and then passive.
All right.
And it's all under the heading of euthanasia.
Yeah.
Euthanasia bad wrong.
Yeah.
Obviously, the active, taking human
Yeah.
But then that idea of passive allowing God, the fact is, I can't keep somebody alive.
Right. Yeah.
There is a sense in which I must allow them
Right.
to die. And but then I got to thinking, with your the abortion slides, sometimes you hear the term spontaneous abortion. All that is a miscarriage.
Right.
It's nothing, no fault of the mama. She didn't cause it. It's just.
Didn't want it. Yep. Right.
But it's the medical term
Right.
spontaneous abortion. We could say miscarriage.
Right.
So I think kind of passive euthanasia, okay, it has to do with death, but not the same little category classification as active.
Yeah, and I think that is the explanation that needs to be given, because in this context with euthanasia, it is not active in the sense where you're causing the death, but there is a conscious desire to allow that person to die. Now, in a natural sense, just like that spontaneous abortion, when natural things take place, then there's not any, as Steve described, we can't do anything about it. But there are some cases where it's a burden on the person they feel like that is dying, and they want to be left alone. Much like 1 Kings 19 with Elijah. He said, "Let me die." Well, God didn't let him die. He was a healthy man. I mean, he didn't have health issues. He had life issues. And he wanted to escape his life issues. And he said there were people who would actively kill you. They had killed their prophets before him. He didn't want to experience that. He looked around him and didn't really see anybody going to keep him protected. And so he just kind of wanted to take care of that himself. Went into a remote place and said, "Let me die." And maybe that's an example that God is saying, that's not how it works. You don't give up on life that way. You don't look at life that way. And you don't look at life, as long as you are connected to God, as hopeless that way. In the context of euthanasia, is you become passive and you allow them to die because things are withheld. You didn't kill them, but you didn't provide for them what could have sustained their life. Now that's the part that we talked about after class. Is okay? Is that the same thing as if a doctor says, "Okay, I've done all I can do. Not really anything else I can do. We can leave them on the machine, and it can breathe for them. Should we leave them on the machine? They're going to still technically have brain waves, and what do we do? Is that the same thing as being passive, allowing to die if you take them off the machine? Again, in that context, we're not participating. We don't want to be part of that person dying. And we've done everything we can do for that person to live. So our attitude and our moral mindset is godlike. We reverence life the way God does. We fit within God's boundaries of how life is sustained and not sustained. We don't push that beyond the measures. Let me give you an example, and maybe just your experience is going to be different than my experiences, but my mother had some health issues, late in life, and she overcame a lot of those. But every time she would have an issue, she had heart surgery a time or two, and really good doctor, just very kind and very skilled. And each time he would say, "Well, Ms. Martin, here's where you are, and you have, 80% capacity, 70% capacity. Here's what you can expect in life, and here are things you can expect to do in life." And every time we'd go, year after year, he would say, "But you're a little further down the road, and so you can't do these things any longer." Then it got where she had some real health complications and had an injury and had to have blood transfusion, and that taxed her heart, who was already weak and just really had issues. And so doctor comes in and he said, he was always honest and yet kind. And he said, sitting in front of her, holding her hands, and he said, "Ms. Martin, I've done all I know to do. I could do surgery. I don't think you'd survive the surgery. I'd just be doing surgery because I could do surgery. But I don't think your heart could take it." She said, "I'm at the end of the road, aren't I?" So we'd have that conversation over and over and over. You know, a little further down the road, a little further down the road. She opted not to have the surgery based on what he described to her. If she'd insisted, he would have done the surgery. Well, her heart didn't have the capacity to take care of everything they need to take care of, and he said in front of her, she and the children are with her, this is what you can expect. He said, you need to make the choices while you can still make your choices. Let your children know what your choices are, what you'd prefer to have and not have. You know, your body's worn out. And now that's getting all out of life you can get out of life. That's not disrespecting life. You know, that's not trying to cut life short. It's like, you know, and we had that struggle. As children, we think, well, we want mothers to hear. You know, maybe if she had the surgery, you know, maybe we would get X number of years, you know, just maybe. You know, isn't there a possibility? But even the scriptures teach that there is a limit to life, didn't it? 70, maybe. And some of us, you know, close. She was okay with that. She lived a good life. She was surrounded by children that loved her. She lived it fully to the very end, and everything that he said would happen in that progressive digression of health happened until she slipped into a coma. And when he talked to us privately, he said, now she told you what she wanted done and what she didn't want done. That's her wishes. And he said, I know. I'm a child. I have a mother. I know what you're going to want to do. When she gets to that point, you're going to want to put in feeding tubes. You know, you're going to want to do this and you're going to want to do that. She said no. And he said, I'm a believer. And I believe God made us. And he said, I've watched enough of my patients that when you've used life up, your body starts shutting down. And it has protective modes that allow them to feel less pain, and don't fight those things. Now see, that's not in the same category of saying this is passive euthanasia, saying I'm going to assist them in their dying. This is a natural dying process that you not artificially, he said, you put in a feeding tube, her body will continue to be nourished for a while, and she's going to be in a coma. She's not going to know she's here. She's not going to be able to interact with you. She's expressed her wishes to you. My advice as a doctor would be to honor your mother's wishes. Well, that was understandable to me at the time, but boy, you got toward the end, you know, we're making those decisions. What do you do? And there's 11 of us. There's a lot of decisions to make, isn't there? But maybe if we do this, and we'll say, we always came back to this. Mother had a really good doctor that she trusted, that really did good things and helped prolong her life. She trusted him. This was her decision based on his advice. she and he asked us to follow her wishes. This was her wishes. I can live with that. Now, I can have to tell you, I didn't want my mother to die. And I had questions, maybe, what if? But that's different than participating in expediting a death. We did not expedite her death. We let that natural process take place. Somebody said, well, but hospice came in and, gave her medication when she was agitated. And say, isn't that the same thing? That's a comfort. We mentioned some passages last week about that specific thing was strong drink being used to ease the pain of death. That's not the same thing. You're not interrupting death. You're making that more comfortable for them. But the doctor even gave us some comfort to say there's these built-in mechanisms that start diminishing naturally the pain process and accepting that. When you look back at the scriptures, I think we understand that we can glorify God in our bodies. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19 and 20. Does that also include death? Can you glorify God in your death? Can you? If we accept that, not trying to expedite that, not trying to escape life, not trying to decide ourselves, that I'm tired of living, I want to end it, but just say, I'm okay with the natural process of things. I can handle that. If we do that, then we glorify God in the process. Go ahead.
When we first met, we knew a lady, mother of a friend of ours. She had cancer, it was terminal, and she coached us through it.
Mm-hmm.
She passed away.
Yeah.
And only in the last few years have I realized the gravity of that whole situation. She was going,
Mm-hmm.
It didn't really sink in until many years later. She was going. There's no way out. She was coaching us through it.
Well, and that's an amazing thing. I had a similar experience with a cousin that she knew she was dying, and they did everything they could. She's a young woman with cancer, and it just had pancreatic cancer, but it was just, it was a brutal thing. But she coached us, and I remember she asked me if I'd do her funeral. Knew she was dying, accepting that. Got every ounce of life she could get out of her body through that brutal process. I sat down with her when she asked me if I'd do her funeral. I said, I will help you die if you will help me live. Teach me how to live. And I think that's the coaching part. I think you can glorify God in that process to say, I'm okay. That's we all are striving to be with the Lord. We're not going to expedite that. Like Paul said, I have a desire to go be with the Lord. But to stay here is more needful. Let's not try to decide when it is that we're going to exit or when it is we think other people are to exit. But in that process, that we glorify God either way. If we stay here and we have to suffer some pain, let's do that to the glory of God. To say, I'm still, as Job said, I'm not going to curse God and die. His wife said, just curse God and die. Get it over with. He said, I'm not going to curse God. God is the one who gave life, and Job saw him as the one who could take life, and he set the bounds of life. When you look at passages like Romans chapter 14 and verse 8, it reminds us, and I hope you don't mind us taking a little personal time here to apply some of these things, because I think it's something all of us either have experienced or going to experience in dealing with family members and loved ones, and maybe even our own death. Romans 14 and verse 8, for whether we live unto the Lord, or whether we die unto the Lord, and whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. That ought to kind of be our moral and ethical motto is, if we live, we're going to live unto the Lord. And if we die, we're going to die unto the Lord. But we're not going to become the ones who make the decisions. You see, you can develop a mindset in society where you have things like abortion because we began to rationalize and say, you know, it's the woman's body and she can choose, and forget that there's a body inside the body. Or we can say, you know, it'd be better for a child not to be brought into a world where he's not wanted, and so that'd be better just to abort it. You know, we don't have the moral or ethical right to make those decisions. We don't. Because that's taking life. And whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And we see the progressive nature of that. Now you go from abortion to euthanasia, even to the point of saying, you know, if people are no longer useful, kind of like that child is no use. I mean, you can just abort it, get rid of it. What's the loss? You get to the end of life and somebody's aged. They're not contributing anymore to society. We just decide, withhold. That's a passive euthanasia. Just allow them to die. Withhold those things that would sustain their life. Not give them the medical treatment that would prolong it or care for them. And that's entirely different than saying all the medical efforts have been utilized. Nothing else can be done. And don't try to artificially prolong the inevitable. I don't know if that helps at all. That's been a real life experience for me of having to make those calls. We have living wills. That was another part of the question is that like this, kind of a passive allowing to die? That's planning ahead of time, like my mother did, to say, here's what I don't want. I don't want a machine to keep me alive. My mother was 87 years old, and she said, I thought I'd probably make it to 50. I'm 87 years old. I'm okay with that. I've got a lot out of this body. I don't want artificially for you to come and acknowledge a machine, you not have me. Not going to do it. We don't know from a living will what conditions might be, but we decide ahead of time we don't want that to be artificial. And I can say that those people who've made that decision, it's a lot better on their families. But that is a tough call when there's nothing been decided and you've got to decide. That's a tough one. Yes?
I appreciate you dealing with this because, frankly, what you've expressed, most people in this room will face
Yeah.
with their loved ones, one or more,
Yeah.
or in how they deal with it,
Yeah.
how then those after them face it,
Yep.
with their heart.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
It's not easy. And making moral and ethical decisions are never easy. You wouldn't have to have reminders and standards. You start with number one, always doing no harm. You don't want to do any harm. Then you have to reason from there, being where God is, all of His goodness and His mercy and His instructions, and then you work from there out. If you start out here with the dilemma and you try to get back to God, chances are you're not going to make it. But if you start with God and say, I want to look at things through God's eyes, and I want to trust in God's design for things, and I want to be compassionate and caring and loving the way God is. And that may mean sacrifice, and that's the part of the euthanasia, because it kind of boils down to either an individual decides, I don't have any use, I can't be of any use anymore, and so I just want out of here. Or for somebody to decide they're not any use anymore, and we want them out of here. Either way, that's not really our call to say, I don't want to suffer the pain If life not exactly the way I want it, then I want to just end it. Can't glorify God that way, to say, whether I live or whether I die, I belong to Him. And I'm going to reverence that, and I'm going to use that, and I'm going to let folks know that, you remember on one occasion, we don't know what the thorn was, but we know there was some pain in Paul's life that he petitioned the Lord multiple times to have it removed, didn't he? And what did the Lord say? No, my grace is sufficient. It was enough that Paul was persistent about asking. He had to just bear whatever that was until he died like the rest of us are going to die. And unless we're alive when the Lord returns, then Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, pointing to the man who wants to die. But I think where we ought to realize is Paul said in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, to die ought to be gain. And I don't mean expediting death, but we ought not fear death. Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13 says, blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. Henceforth they shall rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. There are works while we're here. There are labors while we're here. It's not always pleasant while we're here. But if we die in the Lord, combining Romans 14 and verse 8 with Revelation 14 and verse 13, if we live unto the Lord. If we die unto the Lord. If we die in the right relationship with Him, with the right attitude toward life, choosing life, living life properly, but not controlled and restricted to this life, because we're looking toward eternal life, I think that'll help us make some of those decisions. I hope that helped in some way. It's not going to make the decisions painless. It's not going to make your conscience always clear when you have to be the one to make that call. You'll always second guess. You'll always wonder, what if? But if you know you made it for the right reasons, with their wishes, with their care, with respect for the Lord's design and will and purpose, you can live with that. And He'll take care of the rest of it. He's loving and kind and forgiving even when we make mistakes. I hope those things are maybe a little more insightful. It's more of a talk tonight than it was a lesson, but I hope that helped a little bit. And we'll pick up there. I think time's up, isn't it? I beat the natives tonight. I got through before they... Yes, sir.
Yeah, this debate about prolonged life is going to become more and more in our country because of the fact that in the last 5 years of a person's life, they use a lot more of the medical.
Right. Right.
It's incredibly true. People say, well, those people use too much.
Right.
I think that we do the research to keep the younger.
Right. Right. I think that's exactly right. We're in a society where more and more older people and more expensive medicines and those kind of things. And the conversation is going to be is, we'll give it to those who can really use it, need it, healthy, can contribute to society, withhold it from those who can't. Now that gets into a lack of respect for life. Those of us who are younger and can contribute will need to show the compassion and love of God, give people what they need. If there's still sustainable life, we want to encourage and have it. You're right. And part of that is because I'm the baby boomer generation. We have arrived. We're all reaching retirement age, and guess what? We're all having health issues. Every time I go to the doctor, he says, well, at your age, I know how old I am. I knew before I went there. In fact, I had to fill out papers again when I got there, telling them how old I was. I'm going to him for whatever problem that was. Just deal with my problem. Don't blame it on my age. But we are getting that point where we're going to tax the system. There's a whole lot of us. And with that, me and you as Christians need to know where we are ethically and morally, and we're going to always be kind and loving, and we're going to help people and try to make them enjoy as much life as you can, and learn from them even in that process of death, and aid them in that, and not leave them and abandon them because it's just taxing on us.